Hello, Katerina.
Hi, Veljko.
So, have you heard about 16 Psyche?
16 Psyche. Sounds like a thriller or something like that. No, I don't know. What is 16 Psyche?
It does sound like a Hitchcock movie. It's an asteroid, and the 16 stands for it's the 16th asteroid to actually be discovered, identified, and named back in the 1800s.
And Psyche?
Psyche, the Greek goddess of the soul. I'm not exactly sure why. Of course, celestial bodies were often named after gods and goddesses.
That's pretty cool. So, what caught my attention is that in the 18th century, they were able to discover this asteroid number 16. That's amazing. I mean, they had telescopes at that time that were powerful enough to see this asteroid. How far is it?
It's actually floating somewhere between 250 and 300 million miles away from the Earth.
Amazing what people used to be able to do in 18th century.
This is the Italian tradition. I don't remember the name of the gentleman, but he was an Italian astronomer, so walking in the shoes of Galileo. Okay, so why is this interesting to us, finance people? This is a major piece of rock that's floating out there in space.
What does it mean, major? Define major.
It's a big ball of rock. It's often been described as potato-shaped. And it's about 150 miles in diameter, about 220 kilometers. So quite a big piece of rock.
Big. But
indeed,
to put it in perspective, right, St. Louis, Missouri to Columbia, Missouri, that's about 150 miles, so slightly more than the rock.
When you put it that way, in my mind, this was huger, right? You're absolutely right. It's a big rock, but this puts it into perspective. It's about a chunk of the state of Missouri. So the really interesting thing here is that a bunch of researchers a couple of years ago estimated that this rock is mostly made of iron and nickel with some gold mixed in there. They don't know exactly. But they estimated, based on their best guesses of composition, that this rock, if it were to be brought to the Earth and mined, would be worth approximately 10,000 quadrillion US dollars.
10,000 quadrillion.
Oh, yeah. And in case you're struggling with putting a quadrillion into perspective,
many zeros.
I'm lucky I have a big monitor because I'm literally looking at it. It fits, but I'm not even going to try to count the zeros. One way to put this into perspective is that if you divide this 10,000 quadrillion by the world population, assuming that this wealth was equally distributed, and of course, things are never equally divided, we would all be richer than Jeff Bezos.
But there's many big buts. There's multiple issues there.
Well, there's many big buts, but there's also big rock here, right? So the first issue, of course, is if you were to bring all these metals to Earth, all of a sudden you would increase supply. And of course, the nominal prices at which we are valuing this thing are pretty meaningless. The prices would collapse. It's a bit of a preposterous argument. We all know that you bring a massive amount of particular good to Earth, and the increase in supply lowers the price.
I think I'm a lot more impressed with the idea that humans can actually bring something back from 350 million miles away, dealing with a lot of vacuum and space in between.
And you would be right to be impressed, because the truth is we cannot. This technology doesn't exist. And this is really what we want to talk about today. We have these massive opportunities in space, in the space economy, and they generally require mobilization of large-scale assets. They usually require multiple long time horizons to develop the science, to develop the technology. They're extremely risky endeavors, and the benefits are usually spread out to humanity, the knowledge that you create, the science. And so for all of these reasons, the exploration and the development of space has generally been left in the hand of governments.
Right. It makes me think about also exploration of the Earth whenever the early explorers were still looking for America, etc. The main motivation was a monetary one, obviously, but the amount of knowledge gained in exploring has been incredible. So this knowledge generation followed in the footsteps of profit motives. You can think about space exploration from a similar perspective. People are hoping it's going to enrich them. But wonderful things that could come out of it is just this amazing amount of knowledge that we can gain through it. But yeah, as you put it, is who is going to pay for this space exploration?
I love the parallel because if you're thinking about colonization, we're talking about the British Empire relying on these companies that were hybrid, they were private enterprises, but with strong connections, mandates, and regulation from the government. And in some sense, we're going to see that nowadays we are developing some sort of hybrid approach where venture capital is financing a lot of the next phases of exploration and development of the space economy, while the government is still playing a major role both in regulating and co-financing. For all of this, we're going to have Bill Megginson today. He is teaching a class on spaceflight economics at the University of Oklahoma, a class that's unique in its own. He's going to give us a lot of the institutional detail, a lot of the history, and hopefully a perspective on should space be privatized.
I'm excited to learn more about space industry and the financing of space flight and what's profitable in there and what's not.
One of the things that I'm totally looking forward to is that when you're teaching finance, it's often easy to become cynical about what our profession really is doing. There is a version of financial education that feels like we are endeavoring to make the rich a little bit richer. And sometimes it's hard to motivate our students. And I think that this is just a fantastic example of the good things that financial markets can provide. On one side, you have the need for governments to mobilize these large-scale investments. On the other side, we have a venture capital industry out there full of swashbuckling entrepreneurs ready to take risks and challenges. And perhaps it's going to be interesting to see, can we rely on this private sector, venture capital, private equity financing? Do we still need governments? And I look forward to this discussion with Bill, and I hope our listeners will enjoy it as well. Welcome to Questions in Finance,
a podcast where we translate academic mumbo-jumbo to answer interesting questions in finance. I'm Kate Holland.
And I'm Veljko Fotak. Kate and I met when we were PhD students at the University of Oklahoma.
Today, we're university professors, and we spend our days teaching and researching companies, markets, and all things related.
Hello, Kate, and hello, Bill.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Veljko.
Well, it's nice to have you both here today to talk about the space economy.
Spaceflight economy, not real estate space, but spaceflight economies. I've learned to make that distinction.
I have learned that too. Preparing for this episode, I started Googling space economy, and apparently there's a lot of papers from the 50s and 60s that talk about geography.
Or logistics or warehouses. Yeah, space, right?
We have to preface that there's not too many papers out there about space flight. And Bill is one of the very few people that has a paper, because our focus here is usually to highlight research articles. So today, we're really talking to a person who has the paper about space flight. Another one is by Matthew Weinzel in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, but that's pretty much everything that we've been able to find. And so Bill's paper really covers a lot of the basics and not the basics and explains the industry really well. So we're really glad to have the expert here today.
Thank you, Kate. It turns out if you're talking about the physics or the engineering or the science of space, there's an enormous literature. Even if you're talking about certain aspects of the financing, the practical venture capital, there's quite a lot of literature. If you're talking about the financial economics or the industrial organization of space, I was rather shocked to learn when I was preparing my course, there's just nothing there. And Weinzel's article is quite good, but again, it has a very specific focus on really the government aspect of it. So I found myself having to actually, without being too grandiose, invent the industrial organization framework for analyzing space and the financial economics of it from scratch, which I don't recommend to anybody. This was not fun.
Yeah. We've seen a few things step up, like the OECD and the World Bank. They have published some of the statistics recently too on this. So some of the bigger organizations are stepping up and also publishing some information. But yeah, it seems to be a very new field, especially in finance.
There's been a couple of papers. There's one in JFE specifically about satellites and the information processing of satellites. And they showed that with the information you get from space, essentially, the government's forecast of oil inventories or other macroeconomic factors is really redundant with the view you get from space, unless there's clouds that cover it. So there's a few related aspects that have been published in top journals, but really nothing on the financial economics or the industrial organization.
So what's our main question today?
Kate, before we go there, just for our audience, I wanted to take a moment to introduce, or rather reintroduce Bill. Bill is becoming a bit of a recurring guest. We are blessed on our podcast. Bill Megginson is the professor and Price Chair in Finance at the University of Oklahoma's Michael Price College of Business. For our listeners who are curious, we did introduce Bill in our episode on sovereign wealth funds, and we invite our listeners to go back and re-listen to that one. We always need the downloads anyhow. For the sake of brevity, Bill was a dissertation advisor or co-advisor for both of us, and he's been a mentor, co-author, and a friend. Thank you, Bill, for the great impact you've had on our careers. To get us started, we obviously want to talk about the space economy. It's new, it's novel. We all have some idea of what it means, and yet defining it precisely, it's a challenge. Yeah. I hope, Bill, you're going to give us some perspective there. We'll talk a little bit about the history. I wanted to root our conversation in one main question. When I was thinking about the space economy, the most interesting question for me remains the one about the role of government versus the role of the private sector here. On one side, the space economy really has a lot of the characteristics of a public good. The value can hardly be fully internalized. You have very large upfront investments. You have payback periods that span decades or, well, never, as we're going to see, right? Some of these investments are never profitable, and they carry substantial risk. Yeah. So for all of these reasons, you have the market failures that may justify government intervention. On the other side, Kate mentioned Matthew Wenzierl. I'm probably mispronouncing his last name. This is a 2018 Journal of Economic Perspectives. To quote him, he describes the government-driven, NASA-centric US system as being plagued by weak incentives for the efficient allocation of resources, poor aggregation of dispersed information, and resistance to innovation due to reduced competition. Finally, he points out that NASA's funding and priorities are subject to frequent and dramatic revisions.
Ouch.
We have arguments on one side, we have arguments on the other side. I really hope, Bill, by the end of this episode, we'll hear where do you break.
And I want to add to this is preparing for this episode, besides doing some conventional stuff of looking at research and what's been published out there, I've also talked to some teenagers to get their take on space exploration, Mars, etc. And also some of our local professors in astrophysics and physics to get their take. So I got some unconventional views. But it's interesting that across the board, from teenagers to astrophysicists, one of the big worries that they have voiced is the privatization of space. And the 18-year-olds here in Columbia, Missouri, several of them are actually extremely worried about that. So they understand the efficiency argument. Yet they have all mentioned, and I was surprised to hear 18-year-olds talking about privatization of space, kind of amazed that they were bringing those terms up. But I think that it's on everybody's minds, from teens to all of us. What is the role of government versus private enterprise in space exploration and the space flight industry?
Thank you. Now, I came into it with a similar bias, actually. And again, I've spent my career along with you studying state versus private ownership and finding in general private ownership is much more efficient. So I came into this with the same idea that do we really want to privatize space flight? And quick answer, yeah, it turns out this is far more efficient. And it's not the privatization of space. It's the privatization of space activities subject to extensive government regulation, leadership, and funding. So let me go ahead and kind of start with that. Space activities. What is the space industry? It's essentially the equipment we put up into orbit, launch the satellites, the other stuff. And then by far the more important is the data that we get and how we use it from space. The entire space industry, space economy, is about $600 billion of total revenue around the world. 3/4 of that is private. 3/4 of it is already private, actually more than that. Government are 1/4, and that's steadily declining. But government is absolutely central to the activities of space. They set the priorities. They provide the seed funding, at least some of it. They're extensively regulating it all the way through. So first thing, 3/4 of the $600 billion.
So let's put 600 billion into perspective here.
I'm sorry, that it's my dog. Do I need to go shoot the dog?
No, but you will hear a little bit in the podcast in the back when you're talking. I can only edit it so far,
Basically.
but it's not a problem.
Sorry, we have a 7-month-old Saint Berdoodle who's 50 pounds heading for 100 pounds, and she likes to let people know that she's around and not happy.
The first visitors to space were the dogs. One didn't have a good ending, and the other two came back alive.
I think at some point we might play a game with our listeners. In our first 7 episodes, in each episode, Kate's cat appears at some point. There is a hidden meow in each one of the episodes. We'll offer a free subscription to our free podcast to the listener that can identify the meow in each.
So just to throw in the names, we're talking about Bill's dog making an appearance on the podcast. Laika was the first and most famous animal to make it to space. Laika doesn't have a very good life story, so we'll end it there. But then there's 2 other dogs, Belka and Strelka, who were the first to successfully return back to Earth.
Well, Yuri Gagarin was the first human in space, and he didn't have a happy ending either. He was killed in a space wreck several years later.
Let's actually talk a little bit about the history of this industry. I would like to throw in several questions all at once. I want to put the 600 billion into perspective. I want to talk a little bit about the history of space flight industry, and I want to also understand the role of governments in the whole mix. So there's 3 big things there. Let's see how we can attack them.
Okay. Space economy is basically the things that the launching payloads to space.
Let's step even back. Payload, like that's not everybody knows. What's a payload?
Okay. Everybody knows rockets send things into space. Turns out by far the most common payload that you actually put on a rocket to go to space are going to be satellites of some type, or in this case of Starlink and others, basically transmitters for communication. So payload is what you send into space. Essentially the private part of the space economy. We don't really see the government part of it. It's very important, the military part. The private part of the space economy is the things that are loaded up on rockets, sent into space, and then communicate back send data back to Earth. It's about a $600 billion total revenues of the space economy, which would also include what the government buys, the military buys in an open market. But what we don't include is weapons. And there's a lot of those that are launched missiles. So the space economy, $600 billion. The total world economy is a little over 100 trillion. So the space economy is less than 0.6% of the world economy. It's a very flashy industry. It's a very important industry. But in a macroeconomic sense, it's really quite small.
For now, the investment has been a small investment in it.
In a macroeconomic sense, it's almost round off here. In terms of the play that it gets and the technology and the importance of it, it's vastly bigger than it looks. But as an industry, it's a relatively small industry. And since it's a high-wage industry, its impact in terms of employment is even smaller. But so it's $600 billion per year. 3/4 of that accrues to private investors, private providers. So only 1/4 of the $600 billion is government contracts. So 3/4 of it's already private.
So out of that, we've talked about this payload being satellites. How much do satellites take up?
It's over 80%. It's over 80%. What we see, the really flashy part, the SpaceX launch, the Blue Origin launches of rockets is critically important and absolute vital. And the cost that it's gone down has what's driving the entire industry. But it's a small fraction of the total revenues. Critical, but small fraction. 80% of all the revenues in this, over 80% of the revenues in the space economy are from satellites. And that's been the case for quite a long time. Now, there's many types of satellites. By far the most important are what are called the telecommunications satellite or Earth observation satellites that basically do what the name implies. Telecommunications satellites are the Starlink that communicate with ground station and
provide GPS services to us.
Well, GPS is military, but it turns out GPS, the Global Positioning System, was launched by the U.S. Air Force in 1978. And they actually didn't really want it, but it turned out they put it up, and it is by far the biggest commercial hit of the space economy. Tremendous payoff. Things we don't think of. Uber is a space company. DoorDash. all of the delivery companies are
Apple.
The first Apple iPhone 8 in 2008 was the first one with GPS installed. And since then, we couldn't conceive of life without GPS.
Right.
GPS has been by far the single most important commercial application of space.
It's interesting. The 80% is interesting. That's a big part of it.
And 3/4 is private.
The 3/4 private blows my mind, to be honest.
It's really surprising to everybody.
Yeah, my prior coming into this is all government. But about the headline number, I see your estimate of the value of the space economy to be at about $600 billion. I found some other numbers. Sometimes they're hard to compare. The Bureau of Economic Analysis has a 2023 study that looks at the US space economy specifically, and they estimated in 2023 to be at about $240 billion, which I think is a bit smaller.
But again, that's the U.S. The other part of that is that the U.S. is over half of the global space economy, with China being most of the rest. In terms of the total government spending, $600 billion, call it roughly $150 billion is government. Half of that, over half of that is U.S. government. In fact, I think it's higher than that. NASA's total budget is $25 billion, and it's been constant for several years, and it's going to decline this year.
The US, you're saying it's about half, or maybe slightly more. Then you have China. My priors here would be European Space Agency, and then India.
No, they're not even round. Europe is not even round off.
Soviet Union, ex-Soviet Union.
Russia's third after China.
I have to give a shout out to China in terms of how they've caught up. I think we're going to go a little bit back into history here, but it used to be obviously a US-Soviet Union fight back in time. And I think why we all think this is so government-oriented is because the beginnings go back to military, because US in the 50s had the technology to launch rockets, including nuclear warheads, into any point of the planet, but the Soviet Union didn't. So they needed to figure out a way to do it. That's why they decided to go up into space, to allow themselves to place the rockets anywhere to be able to compete with the United States. The beginning of this race was the Soviet Union-US military race. And I guess that's back, of course, in the 50s and 60s, but it sits fresh in our mind. And at the time, the Soviet Union made huge strides. As we know, we've mentioned the dogs who made it to space first, and then they put the first human into space.
The first woman, first spacewalk. Yeah, they did a lot of first.
But US was very quick to catch up when they did jump in and threw in some funding.
It took a while, but they did catch up. Yes, that's true. Now, I'm not sure we want to go way back, but within the 20th century, the first person to really do any space work of any importance is Robert Goddard, an American scientist. Did it basically with a Guggenheim grant, but he basically was not a loner, but he did this on his own. And he developed liquid-fueled rockets, which is controllable. If it's a solid fuel rocket, not to get too technical, but a solid fuel rocket, once you light it, it's gone. It's going to go. You can't turn it off. A liquid fuel rocket, you can calibrate. You can start it up. You can set it down. So liquid fuel was critically important. So Robert Goddard set the basic patents for that. But then it was the Nazis, particularly Braun and the Germans during World War II, developed the first true rocket, intercontinental rocket, first ballistic missile, which was the V2, Vengeance 2 rocket, which beginning in 1944, several thousand of them were launched against London and other allied cities. That's really when it came into its own, is the Wernblood and the German rocket system from Peenemünde, Germany. And then, of course, at the end of the war, everybody knew this was happening. And all of the allies, the Russians, Americans, British, wanted to capture the German scientists. Turns out that von Braun rationally decided to be captured by the Americans because they had more money. But the Russians got several. The Russians got a gentleman named Korolev, who was the father of their space program.
It's amazing how these key people play a huge role in space industry.
That's exactly right. And Werner von Braun came to the U.S. with most of his team. The U.S. Army had to lie to get him in because he was a member of the Nazi Party. But they basically brought him to Texas, and they developed a U.S. space military rocket system from the V2. The Soviets didn't have the aircraft to bring weapons to the U.S., nuclear weapons. They had the nuclear weapons. So they went to space and developed these enormous rockets. The first one, after I was born, it was in 1957 that they had Sputnik. And this is when they sent this little bitty capsule that freaked out the entire Western world. So very shortly thereafter, one correction I actually have to note for you, Kate, is that NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was launched in 1958 as a civilian agency. And it's kind of important to do that. It still is a civilian agency. Now, all of the early astronauts were military test pilots. And still the case that most of the astronauts are either former or current military officers.
Well, I mean, you almost got to have that training. But back to the key people, you mentioned Sergei Korolev. He actually was tasked in Russia with creating a platform for missile launches.
Yeah.
It's just that this guy, he was interested in space. So he blended the two together. So if he wasn't interested in space, who knows what our story would be like today. So it's the interest of this single individual back at the time in space. Of course, the convenience of achieving some of his other military goals. But what I'm saying is he could have picked another way to achieve the military goals besides space. It was his interest, pure interest in space and understanding of space to develop human knowledge that was key.
Werner von Braun was the same way. He basically was interested in space and rockets in the 1920s, but the only people with any money were the German army. And they basically funded his research, turned it into weapons, but he always wanted to go to the moon much more than he wanted to bomb London. That was just a means to an end.
Science oftentimes finds itself on the back of a commercial interest and a military interest in explorations. I think the exploration of many countries back in the days was also tied together with a lot of economic interest. And then the scientists jumped in.
The same can be said about great artists, too, throughout history. Of course, they've been patrons of rich people or the church. This is where the money is, and this is where it's always been.
My highly intellectual contribution to this conversation was going to be to clarify that the biggest innovations in human history seems to be always driven either by war or by sex. You guys are forgetting the big role of pornography in the development of communication technology and the internet.
Is there a role of pornography in the development of space?
So far, nobody's had sex in space. We would have known about it, so nobody's had
It
sex.
might be difficult physically.
Yeah. One of the things that I noted in the paper is the question, the mother of the first baby to be born in space, is she alive today? And if so, is she Chinese or American? She's one of the two. I actually think she is, and she's probably at least high school age. It will happen probably in the next 15 years. And of course, that person is going to be one of the most famous women in history. It's going to happen. Nobody's been murdered in space. There have been deaths, but all the things that happen on Earth eventually will happen in space, but they haven't happened yet.
I would like to turn our conversation here in a little bit into the funding of space industry. Because to me, as a finance professor, things are always about cost and benefit. Mm-hmm. And honestly, when I was discussing this topic with some of the astrophysicists, my approach to it was the cost-benefit analysis isn't very positive. It's just very expensive to go into space, and especially to Mars. And what is it that we're getting out of it? A big pushback that I received was that we're getting knowledge, and the most valuable part of it is getting knowledge, is understanding what's happened to Mars, because it looks like it might have had some water or oceans on there, and then its core died. So perhaps we can, by learning about Mars, prevent the same happening to Earth. So the biggest astrophysics view out there for the cost benefit is knowledge is extremely valuable, and they all want to get the knowledge. They seem to not support the ideas of space travel. They think that's wasteful. They also don't think that extracting various minerals and bringing them back to Earth is worthwhile. That's too expensive. But the knowledge is what came up on this. How has this knowledge collection been financed?
Okay, that's very much an astrophysicist view of it. And they're absolutely right. That could be done far cheaper with unmanned probes. We've been sending stuff to Mars for a long time, since the 1960s. Right. The vast majority of which failed in the early years. It's only been the last couple of decades, particularly the last 10 years, that Mars probes have been very successful. You've actually had a helicopter operating on Mars for 72 flights. You have a rover that's going around. We know quite a bit about Mars. What is strange about this, of the many things that are strange about this industry, about who pays for it, you have two mega billionaires that are among the richest people in world history, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who want to go to Mars and are paying for it. So one of the things that you can reassure your astrophysicist friend, we're not paying for it. Taxpayers are paying very little for space exploration. Now, on the military side, we're paying for some there, but you can make a case that's necessary.
We probably want to throw in this third one too, right? Because he's going to feel left out.
Richard Branson, Virgin Galactic.
Basically, the Virgin stuff has, one of them's gone completely belly up. The others are limping along. It's these two guys. Now, of course, of which by far the most important so far has been Elon Musk. Now, Bezos and Blue Origin have finally launched a rocket. They finally put payload in space. So they are now part of the equation. Jeff Bezos has invested over $12 billion of his own money. Blue Origin is completely self-financed by Bezos, and he's now quit Amazon and is in charge.
Right.
This is going to be a serious player. But the entire industry is SpaceX. It's been completely driven by the company and within the company by Elon Musk. And it's been investor money. They've had about $13 billion of investor funding, 23 private equity financing rounds, which is extraordinary.
Yeah, I want to throw in that SpaceX operates still in a lot of government contracts because they wouldn't have been able to do what they do without getting the government contracts, because a big part of their financing.
They always acknowledge that. There's no question about it. That's absolutely true. And Musk is the first one to be a cheerleader for NASA. Probably at least as important has been the Department of Defense. Those are critically important too. But no, essentially Musk and SpaceX started privately. They had 3 failed launches before they got anything into space. Mm-hmm. If the fourth one had failed, he would have shut down the company. It worked. And then in 2006, they had the first private satellite into space. 2006, they got their first contract with NASA. So NASA's been absolutely critical to the success of SpaceX. And then by 2012, they were the first private company to deliver a payload to the International Space Station. 2020, they were the first private company to deliver crew to the International Space Station.
And as we know, recently rescue the Boeing launched crew that couldn't come back for a while, but finally did.
Yeah, and what people don't realize is that the International Space Station has been up there since 1998. U.S. and Russia were foundational partners. It's going to be there till 2030.
I'm glad that you're picking it up. Yeah, let's go back to that history. So at some point, the U.S. and Russia team up because they're both now at the same speed and put out the International Space Station, which has been orbiting, taking various measurements, research parameters, etc. And it's launched joint crews to the space station. We also know that there's a separate Chinese space station floating out there. When was that created? Let's talk a bit about that, and then let's talk about Artemis. Can you tell us a bit about that?
The Chinese space station has been launched in pieces beginning in about 2016, but it was finally crewed in 2022. And it's going to be continuously crewed for the foreseeable future. Some Russians now are going to that, but it's separate from the Western Space Agency.
Right.
Artemis, we'll get to that, is the U.S. and its allies in this, but and Russia has been working. The International Space Station came after the space race of the 1960s, which, as you pointed out, the U.S. ultimately won. But once they won, they lost all interest.
I think there's a couple of things that jumped into that mix, because I think that while Russia remains the third contestant in the space race, we're now in 2025, but a lot of the technology has progressed from 1960s, 70s, and 80s, obviously, and US is using the updated technology. If you look on the Russian side, though, a lot of the things that they use there is still the old Soviet technology. Shows how amazingly resilient it was. But in terms of development, obviously, there was a fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, the lack of financing, etc. So while we have this number 3 spot held by ex-Soviet Union / Russia, they haven't really updated their technology where US has. And then China made this amazing jump up to launch their own space station out there.
The space race today and for the foreseeable future will be 2 countries, China and U.S. Everybody else is a player along with it. But the rocket that they use now is a derivative of the original Soyuz rocket. So that particular rocket has been flown 2,700 times, far more than any other rocket. Again, it's reaching the end of its usefulness. And you can even go further. One of the things that happened after the space race, got to the moon, went there 6 times, lost interest, and then basically nothing followed. You had the Skylab, but that was a one-off. For the next 20 years, the U.S. really wasn't that concerned about space. In 1981, they launched the Space Shuttle, which we've all seen, we've all heard of it. Engineering masterpiece, an economic and logistical white elephant. This was just a dead end. And it really did not work. It cost over $1 billion to fly each flight. It was at best refurbishable rather than reusable. And it only lasted till 2011, after it had two major explosions that killed 7 astronauts. After the space shuttle ended in 2011, the U.S. had no way to get anything to space. So until SpaceX came along, we had to send payload cargo to the International Space Station on Russian rockets.
That's a good way to spend money.
Kate, you'll appreciate that many of the rocket engines that the U.S. used until very recently, until really 2 years ago for Boeing and Northrop, the ULA, were Russian rocket designed, but they were made in Ukraine.
Coming from Purdue, I've had multiple discussions. Purdue has a very strong aerospace engineering program with several of my friends working there. So Alina is one of my friends, Alina Alexeyenko, and she has been always amazed at the efficiency of SpaceX in terms of the ability to cut costs and to actually get things done a lot faster than NASA has. She's always been a fan of both NASA and SpaceX. But she has pointed out that the ability to cut costs and get things done quickly by SpaceX, the private company, has taken them all by surprise, and they're all big fans at Purdue Aerospace. Well, at least Alina was.
Well, NASA is too, actually. NASA is too. In many ways, the biggest fans of SpaceX are the U.S. military, because they provided capabilities to put payloads into space and to do things at cost that nobody can even imagine. So let me just take some of the numbers and what SpaceX has done. 2011, the space shuttle ended. There was no private rocket system in the U.S. that could reach the International Space Station until SpaceX basically developed the Falcon rockets. And they've steadily gotten better. So until 2011, when the space shuttle ended, over that long period, a couple of decades to that, the average cost to send a kilogram of payload to space was over $18,000.
Wow. Yeah. So let's throw in a year again, $18,000 per kilogram. That was back in
2011, for basically the 20 or 30 years until the end of the space shuttle. That was the cost to send this payload to space. And it fluctuated a bit. Nowadays, it's currently about $1,000. And when the Starship comes fully online, it could go down to 200. So 18,000 to 200. Already 18,000 to 1,400 for what's already been contracted. This has been a massive decrease in the cost of sending payload to space.
What has enabled this decrease in cost? We obviously know the reusability of rockets that SpaceX has created is one aspect, but what else can take something from costing $18,000 to $200?
NASA admits that it would cost them at least twice as much to do it. So SpaceX is a very particular company and has been uniquely successful. Really three things go into it. And how much you give to Musk or SpaceX, this is a driven company, and they have been incredibly efficient. Two things. First, the reusability came along. But the first reusable was 2015. The first actually reuse of a rocket was 2017. So before that, it was this continuous improvement. Everything was in vertical integration, which as economists, we generally think is a bad idea. SpaceX does everything. They bring in steel, stainless steel. That's about it. They buy the fuel. Everything else is designed in-house, created in-house, and continuously improved. They will spin something up. It'll explode. They'll figure out what happened, fix it. And so there's been this continuous improvement, continuous evolution of both the rockets and the engines and then eventually the payload, all driven by this desire to go to Mars. Crazy. This is an economically insane thing to do, but I'm glad he's doing it. He's using his own money to do it. But so there's been reusability, which came out of it. And the analogy that Musk uses is not having reusable rockets is like building a 747, flying it from New York to London, throwing it away, building another 747 to come back. That's essentially what you're doing. And some of the rockets, the ULA, the United Launch Alliance, they use 4 of the space shuttle engines that have been refurbished that were left over, each one of which is $100 million.
Wow.
And you throw it away. The Ariane 6, the latest European rocket that they finally flew last year for the first time after 10 years, it's expendable. All of the Chinese so far are expendable. You throw it away, use it once. So the only company that's been able to do reuse so far has been SpaceX. They've reused over 400 times. One of their rockets, they've actually reused 25 times, an individual rocket. They're launching 3 Falcon rockets a week.
And so these rockets are taking satellites up to space.
They're taking satellites, or they're taking the Starlink transmitters, which are satellites. They're on the way. They've got about 7,000 already Starlink satellites in orbit. They're going for 42,000. Other companies are way behind, but they have a few. The vast majority of satellites that go to space go to what's called low Earth orbit. There's several orbits. The original GPS and space satellites and the ones that are used for television broadcasting are in what are called geostationary orbit. This is 22,300 miles above the Earth and in one place. So you think about Turner Broadcasting in Atlanta or any broadcasting in New York, they have satellites directly above Atlanta or New York. So they stay in one place over the Earth, 22,000 miles up.
What I thought was cool learning is you need energy to propel you out of the Earth's atmosphere. But once you're out in space, you don't need anything to propel you. You just travel around. And so these satellites are continuously falling onto the Earth, but failing to fall. And that's why they keep circling.
That's exactly right.
Kate just discovered the wonders of physics.
Newtonian physics and economics, market economics, drive this entire industry when you really get down to it. And in many ways, it's the physics that are the most important. Yeah, so in geostationary orbit, it's falling towards Earth, but it continues to fall as the Earth turns. So it stays in one place. Others that are also pole to pole are geosynchronous. They're geosynchronous. They go around the Earth, but they don't stay in one place. Geostationary are the ones that use it for television, broadcasting. You only need one ground station. But again, it's very costly to send something that high in terms of energy. The signal required, the signal degrades with a square of distance. So it's very hard to do that. The vast majority of the satellites in orbit now, and where the growth is in what's called low Earth orbit. This is basically 200 to 500 miles above the Earth. The problem is, of course, your Starlink satellite, it's, call it 300 miles above the Earth, going 17,000 miles an hour. So in 90 minutes, it goes around the world. It's not staying in one place. So to have a constellation of satellites that can continuously service the world in one place, you have to have a lot of them because it's going to stay in your frame of reference for less than an hour. You're going to have to find another one. They're going to have to communicate with each other. So you now have 7,000 Starlink satellites in orbit heading towards 42,000. The Blue Origin Amazon Kuiper constellation is now starting. It's going to have to get to over 3,000 within 2 years. You can easily see where we would have over 100,000 satellites in orbit by 2030. But it's vast majority of these are in low Earth orbit.
So it seems to me that in order to launch something into space, you need to get government clearance or some clearance. It almost seems very similar to getting your rights to drill in a certain area. But here you're getting your rights to launch. From what I hear, there's some competition in this regulation, and many companies are trying to gain ability to launch satellites, but it seems like a bit of a Wild West right now.
Yes and no. Your friends that are worried about government should be running the space program, they don't need to worry. SpaceX, all the privately owned are heavily regulated. Every launch of SpaceX or any of the other rockets has to be the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration.
Right.
They have to comply with safety and environmental rules.
Yes.
So they're heavily regulated. The spectrum is a finite quantity. That's by something called the International Telecommunications Union. The FCC, the American FCC, license American rockets or satellites, but they do it through this international union. That's becoming a real problem because there have been filings for over 1 million satellites. Most of them will never happen, but still you have over 1 million that have been filed for. We have total of about 10,000 of all categories satellites in space now, heading for 100,000 by 2030, conceivably an enormous number. And this is becoming a problem, but that has to be done internationally. So far, SpaceX is by far the dominant player.
One thing that scares me a little bit there is, and I want to get your reaction on this, is that SpaceX has been using some political power to prevent some other licenses. For example, recently it's pushed back on Apple's license, which Apple has been saying that they're using it for emergency communications on phones. SpaceX stepped in trying to restrict their access. How do we want to think about these power struggles?
How about television broadcasters? Anytime you have a finite electronic resource, you're going to want to guard what you have and make sure that there's not unauthorized use. for reasons good and bad, signal quality, emergency use. So I hadn't heard the specific thing about Apple. I've heard others complain about that. That's going to be a contest. That's why you have elections in democratic societies to make those calls between the competing demands for spectrum. It's a finite good. And there's increasing demands on it. And of course, there's the military, which is absolutely central and has been the longest serving player that we don't know about. But they have several thousand, or heading towards several thousand, just US, not to mention the Chinese and the Russians and others. So it's becoming a fairly crowded place. That said, you think about just how big 200 to 500 miles of space above the entire Earth is. This is trillions of square miles. So there's a lot of space there.
We're still talking about satellites flying around the Earth. We haven't started talking about sending missions to Moon and Mars. This is still all around the Earth satellites, basically.
Right. Perhaps this is as good a time as any to talk about Artemis, which you brought up. I teach this space course at the University of Oklahoma. Taught it last year. And there's first of two courses. Mine is the second. The first course was taught by Jim Bridenstine, who was Trump's NASA administrator. I sat in on the class, so saw it from the inside, from the head of NASA for 4 years. It was his idea, and he named it Artemis. Artemis is the god of the hunt in Greek mythology. And it's not a treaty. It's the U.S. and 8 countries, including the U.S., signed this accord. It's not a binding treaty. It's an accord in 2020. It's now up to 53 countries. Right. So it's mostly the European Union, Japan, allied countries that you would expect. And it's a document. It has both specifics. We want to go to the moon using these steps in this way, using this equipment, and ultimately Mars. But it's also, as you go through how do you operate in space? One of the things you don't even think about is you want to have interoperable spacecraft, right? In case there's an emergency where you can rescue another spacecraft. So you want to have basic operating systems. This is all what Artemis does. It has plans for specific missions, and it also has a general framework for space. Now, one of the other things, I get excited about this, but one of the key ideas is the only legal treaty governing space now is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Did two things.
Dated.
Yeah, but it's still the only law we have. It's been universally adopted by Russia, China, everybody. 147 countries have ratified it. It did two things. It outlawed nuclear weapons in space and said you cannot claim any territory in space. So you cannot claim the moon.
I think the teenagers are going to be happy to hear this.
Now, what that doesn't cover, and you think about it, nobody can claim the ocean now.
Right.
But they can claim if they fish or if they find oil or they find minerals, you can claim the proceeds, if you will, the harvest from the ocean. So the question that really was left unanswered by the Space Treaty of 1967, you can't claim the moon or any part of it, but what if you go to the moon and you extract resources, can you keep those resources? That was left unanswered. Artemis answered it, yes, you can. You still can't claim anything. But if you get the resources from an asteroid, the moon, or deep space, you can keep them, which I think is correct. In that sense, Artemis did that. But they've also had a series of, we want to go to the moon. So they've already done one rather badly with NASA, has this enormous rocket called the Space Launch System, SLS, made by Boeing. That's leftover pieces from the space shuttle. It's been a white elephant, but this is what we're stuck with. It's made one trip to the moon without any people at 10 years late. The next one, next year, is going to be Artemis 2, which will send 4 space astronauts around the moon. So the Artemis 2 will send humans back to the moon, but don't actually land. Artemis 3, in probably 27, 28, ideally, will actually have 2 of them go down to actually land on the moon. And then from Artemis 4, 5, and 6, it's going to be actually building out some kind of permanently occupied space station, first on the moon, and then ultimately Mars.
And I'm sorry, but who is funding Artemis? Perhaps you've said it and I just missed it. But where is the money coming from?
The U.S. government part of it's coming from NASA's funding. 50 other countries are part of it. The U.S. is funding over half. NASA's funding a chunk of it, over $3 billion a year. SpaceX will be involved from Artemis 2 and particularly from Artemis 3 on. That's been developed by SpaceX, again, with some government money and contracts, but it's basically been private funding for the equipment develop the equipment. But yeah, government is involved in every aspect of it.
But I think the recent pushback there has been a reconcentration of efforts towards Mars, right? Especially over the last year. There's been an idea put out there by Elon Musk and others that missions to the moon maybe are not as valuable to us as a mission to Mars, and we need to streamline our resources to one core mission. So I actually don't know if these next Artemis missions will happen or whether the money will be redirected to exploring possibilities of getting samples back from Mars.
You have to go to the moon first. Logistically and technologically, you have to go to the moon first. That's going to be hard enough. The Starship, this enormous rocket that SpaceX has developed, over 100 metric tons of payload, over 1,000 cubic feet in its second stage, the cargo part of the rocket. So, I mean, it's incredible. It's the only way to actually get a lot of stuff into space today at a reasonable cost. But even with that, you can get there in many ways, but you can't get back. You can use all your fuel to get there, and then what? There's no fuel there yet. So to actually take a Starship to the moon, what you're going to have to do is put a Starship up in orbit, and then for the next 15 times, put tanker Starships into orbit, refuel that one original Starship, which will then, once it's full, and it'll take at least 15 flights, just to refuel it for a one-way trip to the moon. That's what will actually take, if it happens, take the astronauts down to the surface. It'll stay there. It won't come back.
So what's the approximate cost of that if you were going to put a number on it?
Well, the actual number to the moon, I should know that, actually. We've already spent $50 billion on SLS, launch system, basically a leftover rocket and a refurbished capsule from Apollo. It really is what it is. If you're looking for how bad government can do in space, the Artemis 1 SLS is a classic example. It's just been dreadful.
So what happened in the meanwhile? Armstrong landed on the moon and came back. And how much did that cost multiple decades ago? And now we're still struggling with the same issue. What happened in the meanwhile?
It was Neil Armstrong. During the 1960s, NASA's budget was 0.7% of U.S. GDP. Now it's 0.01. It had tremendous support. The actual dollars at 50 billion probably, what that is in current dollars. So it was expensive, but it was a one-time shot. Again, no economic reason to do that. There's no market on Mars. There's no resources that you can get there or the moon that you can't do much cheaper here.
Back to the astrophysicist arguments, it's the knowledge that we're gaining.
We went to the moon to beat the Russians. It doesn't take a lot of history to see this, but actually, of course, that's exactly what it is. Why are we going back now? Because the Chinese are saying that they want to go.
Right.
As an economist, satellites make sense. The Earth's orbiting space economy makes sense. Going to the moon makes no economic sense. There's nothing there. There's no resources. There's no market, much less Mars.
So you're saying U.S. is doing it partially to hold up its role as the global leader? And
the technological leader. We would not be going to the moon except for China. If China was not going,
we want to be the coolest kid in town still.
We want to be the coolest kid in town with the best technology in town. Yes.
Yeah. But to be fair, we're not. In essence, we're not really trying. You just pointed out how small government investment is. But I want to get us a little bit back to, we were talking about that 600 billion, that headline figure.
That's total revenues of the space economy.
I think you mentioned about 80% of this is satellites. So what's the other 20%? I have this idea that travel to Mars is not generating any revenue yet. I have an idea that some tourism is going to be there.
No, tourism is very small. Over time, it will become a few $1 billion. If you actually do go to Mars or the moon and you set up a recurring mission there, it's like the interstate. You don't have just the concrete for the interstate. You have all the infrastructure, the fueling stations and the rescue and everything else. So if we are actually going to go and set up permanent civilian stations on the moon and Mars, there's going to be a tremendous infrastructure for fuel and communications and repair and launch that's going to go along with that. SpaceX wants to send 1 million people to Mars, and that will be 100 million tons of cargo to Mars.
In astrophysics thinking, this is not a good idea, but it is a good idea to bring samples back from Mars to get the knowledge. So again, to them, knowledge is the predominant issue there. Yes.
No, this has never been the case. The dominant issue in rocketry has always been military. It was first used in combat in the 1200s, the V2 in World War II, the ICBMs in the 1960s. This has all been driven ultimately by military or political competition and the fear of being left behind, right? And this is what's really driving with China.
If Mars billions of years ago was a planet like the Earth, and then something happened to its core to create it a super cold place that it is now, if we can figure that out and that can help us somehow save our atmosphere and the Earth going forward, that would be worth, that knowledge would be worth a lot.
You could reassure your astrophysicist friend that not even his or her great grandchildren will have to worry about this. If there's going to be an explosion of the Earth's atmosphere, it's going to be many thousands of years from now. We basically go to space for political, military, or technological reasons. And all three are at play now.
When you put it like that, I'm honestly surprised at how underfunded this area is, because anything that has that combination of political and military in anything usually would get a lot of funding. While 6 billion, or what Veljko was quoting even more, sounded like a small number, now it sounds like even a smaller number. Why is this industry so underfunded?
I have the numbers here in front of me. The total U.S. government budget for space in 2023 was $74 billion. Of that, $43 billion was the Department of Defense. So almost twice what you spend on the civilian side, you spend on the military side. The Chinese government spent $16 billion. So of all government spending, it's about $125 billion, and $74 billion of that is U.S., $50 billion of that is foreign. So about 2/3 of the total government spending on space in the world is U.S. And of that, well over half, closer to 65%, is defense or reconnaissance by the military or by the reconnaissance agencies. It's going up. We created the sixth military branch in 2019, the U.S. Space Force.
I didn't know that. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. So 2019, the sixth branch of military that was added was the U.S. Space Force.
Trump did it. It was almost unanimous of both houses of Congress. Not quite, but just about unanimous passage of this.
There are two pieces of new media that I think anybody interested in this episode may want to watch. One is a show on Apple TV called For All of Mankind. The premise is really interesting because it latches to something that you guys were talking about. It's an alternative history. But in this alternative history, Russia lands on the moon right ahead of the United States. And that actually spurs the United States to really dramatically increase its space budget because now they want to be the first ones to get to Mars. The show has multiple seasons, and each season follows a specific decade. But by the time we get to the 2000s, the president of the United States is a former astronaut and head of NASA that gets elected to president. Space exploration is top priorities. By the year 2000, now we have flying cars and all sorts of greater advances. But it's interesting that their premise is that losing this competition to Russia would actually spur a greater investment. And then, of course, there is a comedy show on Amazon called Space Force. Stephen Carell is the main actor. They actually take a little bit of a mocking idea to the necessity to prepare for space war.
They shouldn't. That would be a real possibility. Think about it. The most important military satellites are those that monitor nuclear launches. You wouldn't know without these satellites. What Trump has proposed, this golden dome here for the Iron Dome for the U.S., that could actually happen. And that's $10-20 billion. It's really not that much. But this would be 400 satellites monitoring Russia, China for launch, and then 200 satellites that would be attack satellites of some type, either missiles or the real weapons in space are going to be electronics to either blind or disable or jam other countries' satellites. And if you could do that, think about if the Chinese or the Russians were able to, without physical damage, if they were able to blind GPS or jam GPS. Think of what that would do.
Being the devil's advocate, there's a lot less technologically advanced ways of monitoring and getting information. We still have the stealth fighters and other planes that quietly fly over all territories, foreign, and then I'm sure other countries fly over the US and collect information that way.
You actually do not have aircraft that are monitoring China or Russia. The SR-71 was retired 30 years ago. U-2 may do it occasionally, but no, it's rockets, right? It's satellites. That's how they do it. The one called KH-11 or KH-12 is the premier U.S. spy satellite. Nobody knows much anything about it, except that it looks a whole lot like the Hubble Space Telescope and came out of the same factory as the Space Telescope. And the Space Telescope is pointing out 500 light years into space. The KH-12 is 300 miles above the Earth, pointing down, and you can read a newspaper. Not quite, but what you can do with surveillance in space now is just unbelievable. And again, this has not only just military, but in terms of monitoring crops and the weather and climate change. This is all essential, and it's all done by satellites.
Gonna give me an opening here to talk a bit about venture capital, because venture capital has sponsored a lot of these geoglobes, geodomes, flying balloons that will take pictures of the crops. It's a part of this agricultural innovation to understand crops, healthy crops, etc. So we know that venture capital money isn't that, but that's from the agricultural side. We've talked about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos contributing their own personal money to the development of space exploration. But what is the role of venture capital in this, and how much of it is it? What is the role of venture capital in space exploration?
It's central. It's absolutely central. But the phrase that you've heard me say is, space is where venture capital goes to die. There have been very few successful venture capital. That still hadn't stopped them. They're coming in $6 to $12 billion a year just for space.
They're looking for that one out of 100 unicorns. It's just the one hasn't happened yet.
But one of the things that we're all financial economists, the three of us, and many of our audience will be too. So we know that in almost all industry, real industries, technologically advanced, capital-intensive industries around the world, regular aerospace, even trucking, utilities around the world, shipping, all of this technologically advanced, capital-intensive industries are financed in two ways. They're financed by internal cash flow, retained earnings by companies.
And capital intensive just means you have a lot of
fixed assets.
Steel and other very heavy stuff that you got to build, like highways, capital intensive industry.
Or if that matter, a lot of computer technology. So that anything that requires a lot of upfront capital investment, money being invested in the firm. These are all financed either by retained earnings or by debt. Bonds.
Okay, let's translate the retained earnings to our listeners. So if you guys think back to the income statement, you start with sales and sales minus all of the costs bring you down to earnings.
To net income,
then you get this retained earnings. Retained earnings is everything that the company brings in minus all of their costs and what they get to retain afterwards. So
and what they don't pay out as dividends. It's what's reinvested in the firm. Around the world, 2/3 of corporate investment is funded by internal cash flow and retained earnings.
Just as you described, like any other corporate finance project, most of the funding is internally generated, right? It's retained earnings. But most of the business here is government business.
So you're saying the sales are largely paid for by government contracts?
No. It's private. And remember, most of the satellites that are up there are private. All of the communication, except for the military, all of the communication, Starlink is all private. Most of the weather reconnaissance are privately owned. All the revenue that comes from that goes to private investors. They pay for the satellites.
The ownership is private there, but if you think about SpaceX as a company, like any companies, they have sales minus costs. So what proportion of their sales revenue is government related, coming from government contracts? Because then obviously if that's 50% or 80%, that's going to trickle down to your retained earnings as 60% or 80% or more.
Government is very important. It's going to fund it. But again, for SpaceX, where's most of their revenue coming from? A chunk of it is going to be NASA, but a much bigger chunk is going to be launching satellites or other stuff for other players, right? They have the 3 launches a week. Falcon 9 is their workhorse. 3 a week. and it's doing satellites and it's doing things for other players, not government. So the ones that they're doing for government are important. The things they're doing for NASA are important, but it's far below half of the revenue for SpaceX is going to be government. By far the most important single source of revenue and how they're able to do this is their Starlink, the 7,000 satellites. That's all private. The government does some contracting. The military now has what they're called a Star Shield, the militarized version of Starlink. That's still very small. Now, so no matter how you cut it, government is important in this, but it is overwhelmingly private and driven by private entrepreneurship, mostly around satellites and data and communications.
I don't know how much of Starlink funding or sales are coming from governments. It would be interesting to find out, because with the war in Ukraine, the government was throwing in a lot of money to help finance Starlink for the military purposes abroad.
Not at first. At first, the government wasn't paying anything. SpaceX essentially opened it up to Ukraine, and it was vital. Because the first thing the Russians did when they invaded was to take out all of the communication satellites and destroy all the ground systems for Ukraine, which were fairly easy to do. And then they turned on Starlink.
And then the government, U.S. government, stepped in and said, okay, we will pay for it.
The analogy of that is think about why Taiwan is not being serviced by Starlink. And they don't really have a satellite service. So all of Taiwan's internet communications with the rest of the world, and a very technologically advanced society, is 8 internet cables. In the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, what's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to cut those cables. So this is fundamentally and ultimately, it's commerce, but ultimately it's also defense of your homeland to make sure that you're not attacked by a bigger, stronger neighbor. So government's very important. Civilian, but also the military side of space is, in many ways, that's where the most cutting edge stuff is occurring. I'm an economic historian. I love history, as you guys know.
Of course.
You got to search in vain historically for any company that has had this kind of impact, or any entrepreneur that has had. Henry Ford is the one that comes to mind. But what Elon Musk has done between Tesla and SpaceX dwarfs what Henry Ford, Bill Gates, any of the classic entrepreneurs, Henry Kaiser, and what they've been able to do now in 2 industries, but particularly with space, how they have driven it. And
let me catch you on that love of history and help you maybe advertise your class a little bit. I'm honestly just curious, and I think maybe a lot of people are curious. You are teaching a class on the space industry economy at the University of Oklahoma. What is that class like? Can you take us through the 4, 5, or 6 main themes and how you've structured it and what you present to the students?
Yeah, there's an interesting history. We have a well-established aerospace and defense MBA program at the University of Oklahoma. Tinker Air Force Base, the biggest Air Force base of its kind in the world, is right outside. So it's always been aerospace, it turns out. Aerospace and defense are the second largest employer in the state of Oklahoma after energy. It's an important thing. Essentially, a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, they wanted to do a space certificate, courses in space that they could give in this program.
I like the synergies there because energy is taken up by Houston, and they've got a few universities down there. So I think it's very smart of the University of Oklahoma to take their advantage on the space industry.
We're good in energy too, but the Air Force, that's basically what's here. So it made sense that we would do space or military. It was logical to have the space course come out. Either I volunteered or was volunteered to do this, thinking that it would be well established. To our knowledge, there's still not a space finance course taught any other university in the world. There's already courses available in Oxford, Harvard. Several other universities have space strategy or economics, or they have space-related courses. But in terms of the actual financing space, I had to invent it. This is something that I didn't realize. I thought it was just going to be venture capital applied to space.
Right. That's interesting. I like that take. So you honestly were initially thinking about it as a venture capital class, which we know you've taught some VC classes. I've taught some applied VC classes.
How hard can it be, right? It turns out it's not like any other industry. So I had to look at it. And this is where the spectrum, I've worked with you two guys on state ownership and privatization. As I really tried to grasp what was going on in this industry, that's how I crystallized structuring it and analyzing the industry along a spectrum of private ownership. The 4 sectors that I basically had to come up with is going to be the science, pure science and space exploration, NASA, what NASA does. That's pure government, right? That's going to be funded by, originated, monitored, run by government. Okay. The second big sector was military. And it's huge.
Right.
But that, of course, you want to be government. We really don't want to privatize war. It's happened in the past. But so the military sector is, again, state-run, state-funded, with increasing private entrepreneurial input and making the equipment and driving it. But those two are largely government funded.
So science and military.
Science and military, the first two that you can kind of understand. The third sector would be human exploration. The biggest part of that now is the International Space Station, and then everything about going to the moon and Mars. It's very mixed. Government plays a role. Government runs the ISS. Well, they did. Since 2012, it's been a private contractor that actually manages, under contract from NASA, actually manages the ISS. And any replacement is going to be privately owned from the very start. In SpaceX for human exploration, it's a mix of government and private with a lot of entrepreneurship. And the next one, the final one, is commercial. Pure commercial. That's mostly satellites.
I like labeling stuff. So if I'm going to relabel, throw in some letters to it, I'm going to say S for science, M for military, H for human exploration, and C for commercial.
Oh, that's cool. Okay, I hadn't thought about that.
SMHC is kind of like the setup here. But just listening to it, it seems like 3/4 would be government finance, government interest, and 1/4 the commercial is not. But what we'll see, and I'm assuming you're going to talk about it, how this 1/4 became a much larger, more profitable sector out of this SMHC.
The C is by far the biggest chunk. Government also plays a role. They have satellites as well. They pay for services, but that's overwhelmingly private. And the entrepreneurship is largely in that. Historically, government dominated the early satellite. They were all either GPS or communication satellites or monitoring satellites for the military. It's only as they became much more commercial in terms of communications and wireless and broadcasting.
About these four main functions of the space industry.
It made sense to analyze on an entrepreneurial spectrum. And then from a finance point of view, each one of these is going to have a different finance model for how it's going to operate, be funded, the revenues that it's going to generate, and where the entrepreneurship has a chance to play out.
So then you try to talk about the entrepreneurship aspect in each one of the fours there.
Correct.
I see. Interesting. S for science.
Science is being cut. One of the things, rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly, the Trump administration is probably going to cut the science budget of NASA in half. They're going to whack the budget from $25 to $20 billion.
This conversation about NASA's budget is interesting because we do have a little bit of a problem, or at least a perception of a problem, where you have SpaceX being so closely interwoven with the government. Maybe we can address that later. What I wanted to ask you rather about is, I have a quote from 2015 by Neil deGrasse Tyson, where he was talking about venture capital in the space industry. And in 2015, he famously predicted that the first trillionaire was going to come from the mining of either the moon or space asteroids. We are not talking about mining at all.
Not yet. No, the first trillionaire will probably be related to space. It's probably going to be Musk or Bezos. So, but it's not going to be from space mining. It's going to be from space satellites and building the rockets that get you there.
So where Hollywood taught us that we were going to get rare earths by catching a couple of asteroids, that's still deep sci-fi.
It will happen 50 years from now. And there will be space mining, but the space mining will be looking for water. In space, water is far more valuable than gold. To make Mars or the moon habitable at all, you're going to have water. It's going to be for consumption, for cooling, but also what you can do with water. I'm a chemist. What you can do with water, you can hydrolyze it and electrolyze it, and you can make hydrogen and oxygen. These are rocket fuel. The first thing we're going to be looking for in space is going to be water. And that's going to be the fundamental both for life and for fuel. Over time, 50 years from now, we will be doing space mining. But think about it. There's 15,000 metallic asteroids. There's millions of asteroids. Most of them are rock and ice. The 15,000 metallic asteroids in near Earth, meaning within a few light years of Earth. They have one, NASA's sending a probe to one called Psyche 16. It's an asteroid. I think it's 1 or 2 miles wide. The nominal value of this asteroid in terms of the gold and palladium and platinum is 75 times world GDP.
Wow.
Right. So it seems this huge thing. How in the hell are you going to get there, right? You have to go, it's going to take 6 years for a probe to actually make it there, consuming all of its fuel. Then what? You get to an asteroid There's no gravity. There's no atmosphere. How do you slow down? You have to have fuel to slow down. It makes no sense for the foreseeable future to do mining for anything other than water. So I'll just leave it at that.
I'm going to jump back to your class. You highlight the 4 main areas of space, and you talk about how entrepreneurship activities have penetrated or influenced those 4 areas. Any specific examples or 2 of your favorites for the class?
But by far the most important of any aspect, what has happened in space in the last 15 years has been the decline in launch cost. Decline in launch cost and the increase in capacity. This has opened up the ability to send payload to space, to send more and larger satellites to space at far lower cost. And of course, along with that, on the satellite side, the capability of satellites and the size required has been going down steadily. They now have what are called CubeSats, which are several thousand. This is 4 by 4 inch. You can have real science done with 4 by 4, and you can load these things up. So satellites have been the biggest user, but also the James Webb Space Satellite was sent up it wasn't by SpaceX, but this was actually sent up as a origami, had to unfold. Now they could send the whole thing in a SpaceX, in a Starship. But when they launched it in 2021, they couldn't do that. So they had to do it on an Ariane European rocket. You now have the availability to send up large payloads relatively inexpensively, or multiple payloads on a single launch. The cost has gone down. And the analogy I make in the class is to think about what was the impact on commerce when you switched from sail to steam for ships, or you shifted from horses to rail for surface transportation.
Wow. I like those comparisons.
Even canals in the Middle Ages, when you reduce the cost of transportation so much that it not only makes what you're originally doing cheaper, but it opens up entire areas of new activities. And this is what's happening in space now. As the cost declines to $100 or $200 per kilo, it's cheap. You can send stuff up. At some point, the environmental impact of having 5,000 launches of rockets a year you're gonna have to deal with that at some point, but down the line.
How much stuff is flying around there that's just trash now?
The identifiable, as in 4-inch square, they call those identifiable by radar. It's 25,000 plus. If you think the size of a bolt or bigger, it's well over 100,000 items in space. And again, they're going 17,000 miles an hour. Bolt hitting something at 17,000 miles an hour is going to have the kinetic energy of the largest cannon shell you can imagine.
Interestingly, nothing has collided at all until recently. There's just been one incident where 2 objects.
Yeah, 2009, an American and a Russian satellite collided. And it's the only one that's ever happened. We would know about it. And it released 3,000 space debris items. This is one of the problems with at least 5 countries have anti-satellite missiles where you can destroy a satellite. Problem is, you create thousands of pieces of debris from any kind of an explosion, kinetic explosion space.
So you got to clean that up, and that's going to be a whole other industry developing. They're, of course, very difficult to finance it because nobody wants to clean things up.
It's a collective action problem. Again, that's one of the things that everybody thinks is going to be a big industry. I can't see how it's going to be. Actually, the economics of that don't seem to make any sense. And remember, just low Earth orbit, 200 to 500 miles up over the entire Earth. The average size of the 25,000 debris items is the size of a baseball. You see these pictures of the Earth with all this observable debris around it. It looks like it's very crowded. Space is big.
Yes.
There have been one collision in the entire history of space. Most of the satellites now are maneuverable to some degree. And they maneuver when you have a 1/10,000th chance of a collision. So it's really easy to overstate just how dangerous the Kessler effect is what it's called in space would be. A collision, starting 5 collisions, starting 25 collisions, nuclear reaction type. It's easy to visualize that, but it's implausible given how big space is.
It sounds to me like the commercial satellites are the key profitable part so far of the business.
Yeah.
But the news headlines are all about going to Mars. I don't know why it's not Mercury or Venus or Pluto, but it happens to be to Mars.
Because Mars is closer.
It's actually similar distance to Venus.
It's the most Earth-like of the planets.
Yeah,
but,
fair enough.
Yeah, Mars only every 2 years for a couple of months that it's only 70 million miles away. 6 months one way travel by the fastest rocket. If you get there, you have to wait 2 years and have a way to come back. There's so many things. Going to Mars sounds like it's plausible. Technologically, we have no clue how to do it now. And economically, there's absolutely no reason to do it. But we have these two very rich people who are willing to pay. And so we're going to do it. We're going to go to Mars. We're going to go to the moon. We're going to have space stations. We're going to have colonies. We're just not going to have to pay for it as taxpayers. So why not? And the spinoffs are going to be huge. The technological commercial spinoffs from this are going to be massive.
I think that the public at large might underestimate the amount of technology transfer that comes from space exploration. I worked in a patenting office a long time ago, and I remember reading a little bit about the history of the patents that were linked to space exploration. And things like LCD screens were invented for the first space shuttle, and then they made it into our common life, for example. Right? So you have these technologies that in your mind you don't necessarily associate with space.
Solar panels. Why would you need solar panels if you weren't outside this Earth atmosphere?
That's correct.
A lot of things are like that, yes.
Yeah. On the other side, I also see the danger here. And I want to talk about jobs a little bit here and about perhaps some missed promises in the past. I entered my undergraduate program at the Rochester Institute of Technology in the year 1996. It was also the inaugural year for the new space tourism program at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And I actually knew a couple of people that enrolled in the space tourism program. I don't know what happened to them, but I strongly doubt that they're working in space tourism nowadays. You want to admire somebody that's forward-looking, but...
They were probably Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos.
Musk is only 51. I'm not sure how old Bezos is, but Musk is 51.
But anyways, how many jobs does the space economy create nowadays? And what is your expectations about this trajectory? Do we have a headline number?
Given the focus that you've put on the infrastructure, I wonder how many jobs it could bring to the US based on infrastructure. Since we want to bring manufacturing jobs back, why instead of creating couches, we don't create some space infrastructure? What is the number of jobs there?
SpaceX, they build everything themselves. They bring in literally stainless steel, and they have designed everything. What you don't think about is Uber is the most valuable publicly traded space company. Nobody thinks of Uber as a space company, but with a little thought, you see there's no way they would exist without it. Airbnb, DoorDash, all of the delivery companies are ultimately a space company. Now, Apple, with its iPhone, is based on this. All of the communications are based on GPS. So space is pervasive in the impact. It has not created that many jobs, but when all is said and done, how many jobs is the semiconductor industry directly created, right? Mm-hmm. So anything that's technologically advanced is going to create a relatively few PhD level or master's level jobs. But the spinoff, the ultimate impact is going to be huge. Transportation, logistics, all of this measure and optimize the delivery of trucks, the delivery of ships, the scheduling of aircraft. What is going to be the economic impact of positioning and navigation and scheduling?
So I found a report in 2023 by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They actually have it at 373,000 in 2023, but they're taking a more conservative approach than what you are advocating for. They're looking at direct jobs created. They say full and part-time, 373,000, but most of the direct jobs that they claim here are manufacturing jobs. So the manufacturing of rockets, the manufacturing of satellites, but they're not taking into account what you're talking of, this spillover into other. We don't think of Apple as primarily a space company, and yet where would Apple be without satellites? We don't think about Uber as a space company, but where would it be without GPS? And yet, I don't think that saying 100% of the workforce of Uber is space economy workforce is a fair assessment. I don't think zero is a fair assessment.
It would not exist without it. The other side of that is how many people are in the U.S. automobile manufacturing industry. There's only 50,000 UAW workers. Even if you multiply that by 4 with all the transplants, you're talking 250,000 people total that actually manufacture and assemble cars in the U.S. And yet, would we consider the U.S. automobile industry trivial? Of course not. The direct is going to be a part of it, and that's what the most visible. But no, the spillover of the car industry, of the space industry.
I am not that old, but I'm old enough to remember a specific word without GPS. And between 1992 and the early 2000s, the entire Balkans and northeastern Italy did not have operational GPS. At first, it wasn't operational at all, and then it was greatly handicapped. And that was largely linked to U.S. military operations.
Yeah, it was a position of navigation and weapons delivery technology. It was to be able to drop weapons. For the first many years, it was purely military, purely U.S. military. What changed, some of you may remember this, certainly you too, you may not. 1982, Korean Airlines Flight 007, coming from Seattle to Seoul, strayed off course and went over the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. A navigation error because they didn't have good navigation tools. And the Soviets shot it down, shot the airplane down, killed 250 people. It was then that President Reagan opened GPS up to first commercial aviation. Immediately after that. So for a few months or a year or so, it was just commercial aviation, and then it became so important that he opened it up to everybody. But essentially, that is a military technology that was opened up to make airline travel much safer because of navigation. And then it became just omnipresent all over and all the spillover industries that came out of it. You never know. The telephone. I guess my favorite example is with the printer, photocopier printer. When that was developed in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the original estimate was this was going to replace printing machines. And there were going to be 5 in the whole world that you would need. That's not what it was used for. It became, how many in your office do you have now? So there's spinoffs and there's derivatives from technology that we really literally can't imagine. And this is going to be certainly one of them.
It sounds like there's just a lot of uncertainty about how many jobs this can create. It could create a lot of jobs. It could be very few. They're for sure going to be valuable, but it sounds like we really don't know what will be the job outcome of the space industry over the next 10 years.
That's probably safe. And the other side of that is how many jobs does the defense industry create? What makes a country safe and immune from attack? How valuable is that? In many ways, it's going to be the harm kept away by what satellites can do is going to be one really big part of it. Do you really want the Chinese to win? To have the cutting edge technology and be dominant in space, to be able to block all the transmissions, to be able to disable Allied or American surveillance, which is certainly a possibility, or be able to negate communication satellites.
But Bill, all I hear here is a very good case for the government to finance the space economy, right? We are talking about military, but we're also talking about the difficulties for the private sector to extract an economic profit, right? You're shaking your head, but you mentioned this is where venture capital goes to die.
Right. So far, some of them make money, not many. They keep coming. They think they will in time.
I fully embrace your point that if there are a bunch of wealthy CEOs or owners that want to spend their money to advance humanity in the exploration of space, by all means, we should embrace it.
Taxpayers are going to pay some, obviously.
But let's say that you're not Bill Megginson, the finance professor, but you're Bill Megginson, the portfolio manager. Would you allocate any of your private sector investments to the space economy, or would you recommend your clients to do that?
Now I would. One of the things that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is venture capital, until Ukraine, shied away from defense. Now, Enderil and Palantir are some of the most valuable venture capital-backed companies. In defense, you have a tremendous amount of venture capital going into it. A big chunk of that will ultimately go into space. The other analogy is, what was the computer developed for? What was the very first ENIAC was developed for what?
Ballistics, missiles, trajectories.
It was paid for by the U.S. Army to do artillery shell projections. That's in 1946. That's what it was for. You do an artillery shell 20 miles downrange. You have to account for weather, the curvature of the Earth, temperature. That was what the computer was developed for. Is it now just strictly a defense technology? No, it became commercial and has revolutionized our lives and has
allows us to do the podcast.
Allowed us to do the podcast. What was the airplane developed for? You said it yourself. The military has pushed technologies, including the care of wounds, medical technology, battlefield technology is where most of the advances in penicillin was commercialized during World War II for the Allied forces.
I love all of these examples that show how some government inventions and innovations have spilled out into huge commercial successes in unexpected ways.
The internet was basically completely funded by DARPA, the military. In case there was a nuclear attack that took out the telecommunications network, you would have decentralized.
Yeah.
But it was founded by the government, right? These technologies are necessary, and yet it's not clear to me why these are not the perfect example of basic science that should be in the hands of government. The traditional model of financing basic science is usually through the government because you have a very hard time internalizing all the benefits of basic science. And because of that, the private sector generally underfunds. And it seems to me like this has all the characteristics of the type of scientific inquiry that would be underfunded by the private sector and would need government support.
Yeah, basic science has often been and usually been done by the government. Telephones. In 1980, the only country in the world that had a private telephone system was the United States. If you look at every country, how did the telephone system come into society? Where did it come from? In every case, well, essentially every case, it was the Army Signal Corps. That's where the technology within any country came, was by that. And then it was, of course, commercialized and disseminated out. So every technology is, almost every technology has a government origin, or all modern technology, at least it played a major role, which then it's commercialized, often with payment of a fee to the government. For many pharmaceuticals, the basic science was funded by the government.
Let me take us back to this financing question. We talked a little bit how space is a hugely capital-intensive industry because you have to create these rockets, lots of equipment, and that usually you finance capital-intensive industries or projects with retained earnings, the money that the company makes after costs are paid, and debt. I want to better understand how much debt do we have coming in? Is this coming from venture capital? How much government financing and how much retained earnings in this industry as a mix?
Yeah. There are no retained earnings, right? None of these firms are profitable. The only one, SpaceX may be, Starlink may be cash flow positive now. It has a $350 billion valuation, private valuation, that with zero net income. It's all the future. And this is what venture capital does. It finances industries that have tremendous potential, but no current cash flow, right? So this is where venture capital has played an absolute central role. You can't have debt with a little basic finance knowledge or even intuition.
Got to have collateral.
What do you have? You have to have something that's collateralizable, right? It has value in and of itself that you can seize. Vast majority of the new tech that's created in space is going to be very specific to that particular company. Most of it's going to fail. Even if it's successful, it will be obsolete within a year or two. You can't collateralize the assets. You can't collateralize brains. So you can't collateralize the assets of the space industry. This is all the future, and it's all technology, and it's all patents to a degree. But it's mostly not things that you can borrow against.
So our two main sources of financing, retained earnings and debt, are out of the window.
Yeah, by and large, it's out of the way. It's venture capital and government contracts. Government contracts are very important, particularly the early stages of space exploration and new technology. Even if it's 25% of the actual development, I'm sure it's higher than that. I don't have the number on top of my head. The government contracts are central. They're absolutely critical. It's just once it becomes as an industry, the heavy lifting is done by private capital. And that's largely true. One extraordinary company that is unlike any other. I really do not want to become a Elon Musk fanboy. This is just the last thing I would ever want to do. But the more you look at this industry and this company, SpaceX, it's hard not to be. They've done extraordinary things, and we overuse that term, but there's literally no comparison in technological history. Economic history.
Let me cycle you back to your paper, and I want our listeners to know about William Megginson's paper titled The Financial Economics of Spaceflight. I would like for you to highlight some of the big takeaways from there. One is going to be, and I'm building up on your discussion of Elon Musk right now, one is going to be a huge decline in costs, as you've mentioned previously, from $18,000 to $200, which was largely achieved through SpaceX. So that's one big takeaway that I know you've mentioned, and it's probably highlighted in your paper. But if there's our listeners who haven't read your paper, what are some of the other big key points that you'd want for them to remember?
3/4 private. is the other one that really comes out. The fact that it's a glamorous, gets a lot of press industry, but in a macroeconomic sense, it's well under 1% of GDP. It's a relatively small industry growing very rapidly. It's driven by both commerce and political competition. It's largely a two-country race between the U.S. and China. The U.S. is still significantly in front, largely due to SpaceX. But China is a formidable competitor. It's a competition between these two countries that's going to drive much of it. And the amount of money and brain power that's being invested in space is going to drive this. It's going to grow much faster than the overall economy, even though it's relatively small now. Those would be the most important features. And satellites, the overwhelming importance of satellites. From a financial point of view, it is a very strange industry in the way it has to be financed and its cash flows and the fact that it's so difficult to finance with traditional financial means. But if you go back to the semiconductor or the internet, many nascent industries in their early years struggled with this. They didn't have established cash flows. So venture capital has always played an important role in new technologically advanced industries. It's just outsized role here.
For my friends who are interested in anthropology and sociology and ethics. So we are talking about the space industry. We as finance professors are mostly interested in how one finances it and the cost-benefit analysis, what is the profitable part here. But what if I'm in sociology or anthropology or ethics? What am I looking at when I'm thinking about the space industry?
Political competition would be the first thing that came to mind.
Interesting.
Why did we go to the moon? It's a touchstone. It was not for science. It was basically to beat the Russians. Many things in a society will be driven by overarching values rather than direct economic competition. The technology spinoff and the way it's impacted our lives, right? Pick up your cell phone and look at how much of that is enabled by space. It tells you exactly where it is. The precision timekeeping is based on GPS.
Has enabled a lot of parents to see what's happening to their children at 1, 2, and 3 a.m.
It has this huge impact on our lives in ways that we don't think about, of which location and GPS is by far the most important, but also communications. Not to mention, it keeps us safe from some nasty players in the world who would do us harm. And we want to be able to do more harm to them than they're doing to us. I don't mean to keep coming back to the military, but the Space Force, it's been in business now for 6 years. Until very recently, all it talked about was defense. We want to protect American assets. They've now switched this year, like all the other military services. If there's a conflict, we're going to win. So a war-winning strategy. So it's become one of our 6 warrior services. And you want to have that if you're a democracy in a world with sharks.
Interesting political angles, interesting things that I wasn't thinking about. Hopefully our friends in sociology and anthropology take some ideas. It seems like a lot of things to develop there.
They have little to fear from private ownership. That's really an important thing to get across. It has been not only efficient, but it's highly regulated. Nothing happens that is not approved by democratic lawmakers and democratic government, at least on the U.S. side and its allies. It's just much more efficient, but it is ultimately answerable to elected bodies, just like everything else we do in a democratic society.
I guess it's good for people to be cautious, for example, our teenagers about it, but it's also good to have the answers that at least for now, everything is being well developed in terms of space in private hands and has been largely well regulated. Yep. If we look back to the past, we've had collaborations between Soviet Union and the US previously that have created these global alliances. So we'll see how this works into the future. Who knows, maybe China and the US and other countries will collaborate.
Yeah, we did. After the first space shuttle disaster in 1986, for 12 years, the US, NASA, contracted with Chinese rockets to take stuff to space. And it was an American amendment in 2010, and then every year since, has prohibited NASA from cooperating with the Chinese in any way. So it's not like the Chinese cut us off. We said and still say, no, you cannot cooperate with the Chinese. They then went their own way and had to develop everything on their own. This is essentially a self-inflicted wound in terms of the competition with China.
The geopolitics are really fascinating. You often hear this narrative about how we lost a little bit the plot in space exploration after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the lack of a competitor. Perhaps this might be one of the positive outcomes of competition with China.
But why are we doing this? We're economists. Is there an economic reason to go to the moon and Mars? No. We're going to do it essentially to beat the Chinese. And we have very rich people who are paying for it.
I'm going to have a more benign view on this because it could be viewed in a more benign way. Think about what is the point of listening to a beautiful opera, seeing a beautiful piece of art, or going to a national park. It's just like the enjoyment that you get from it and the knowledge that you derive from listening to certain music, seeing a certain piece of art, seeing a certain area of the country and its nature. So I think the same can be attributed to space and space exploration. Humans are interested in it for the pure knowledge and for the development of the race and for the beauty that comes with it.
Kate, I'm very glad to see you haven't become cynical because you reached close to middle age as your mentor, your professor has. Hopefully you won't become as cynical and jaded as I have.
I'm a true believer that beauty is really ultimately what most humans want to aspire to, because what else is there?
I have been following closely the debate last year about the Indian space exploration program.
Yeah.
And it's doing well, it's doing it on the cheap, and yet there was a huge civil society pushback in India because there was this perception that this was a misallocation of resources, that food for the soul is still less important than food for the stomach.
Katy Perry got such feedback from going up on the Blue Origin rocket. You can always make that case. Is this something you should be spending money on while you have poor folks?
But you're looking at India running a huge deficit. Some of it is financing the space program. I think this is a strong case for the private sector, right? Because at the end of the day, somebody should be free to spend their own money.
Interesting perspective, yeah.
In any capitalist society, if you have freedom and you have the choice of where you want to invest and what you want to do, you're going to have a lot of things created. Some money is going to be wasted, but you're going to create wealth. You're going to create technologies that otherwise would not be created. It's basically positive.
I want to ask you one last question, Bill, before we wrap up, at least on my side. I don't know if Kate has anything, but a private sector space industry seems to be right now a purely US phenomenon to me. Am I misinformed? Or
that's one of the reasons the Europeans have fallen so far behind. Is it's basically Europe falls behind in almost everything, but in this it's because everything they have to do collaboratively, 20 countries to get it done, and they have to coordinate it. It's government run. Yeah, Airbus is a private company. Arianespace is technically a private company, but it's all the money comes from government. Now they're trying to, now that they've had this political split with the U.S., they're really panicking and don't want to be dependent on SpaceX. They don't want to be dependent on GPS. So military. This year, things have happened in the European context that they may get their act together and become a player again. I don't think it'll happen, but it certainly could. Japan is mostly government, although they just had a very large private IPO. India is mostly government. China now, the private sector, to the extent that you really have a private sector in China, is getting involved with space. So it's all over the world they're becoming. Rocket Labs is the only other American company that's routinely launching. That was in New Zealand, and it's now been moved to the U.S. So the action is on the private side.
Can I just, as a proud European, push back on that statement a little bit? We are falling behind on some things like booking cabs, but when it comes to beauty and food and fashion, we are not necessarily behind in everything. And I will just say, I had a chance of seeing one of the SpaceX launches.
Did you really?
And it was fascinating. It really was something. Bill, before we close, is there anything else to mention that we didn't ask you about, that we left out?
Last night I did the exits from the industry, IPOs, mergers and acquisitions, things like that. The night before I did financing, venture capital, and then I've done the law. Then last one is going to be the future. The next week is going to be, is there a future for mining? No. Is there going to be a future for space cleanup? Probably not. Are we going to Mars and the moon? Yeah. Whether we should or not, we're going. And there'll be the technology built out for that. Satellites, it always comes back to, they're going to have a ton of satellites being put into space, increasingly capable, increasingly sophisticated, and we'll have 100,000 of them by 2030.
Wow.
Awesome. That's a good way to wrap it up.
Let's summarize. For our listeners who are just jumping in towards the end of the episode, what are the several key takeaways from space industry? I can throw in one. The costs have declined significantly from 18,000 to 200 a kilogram to launch something into space. Huge cost reduction.
Huge cost reduction, huge expansion in the capability of putting stuff in space. And with the cost reduction and massive increase in demand currently, but in the future, as the costs are built in, the industry, every time you have a massive reduction in transportation costs throughout history, you've had a massive expansion of economic activity.
So number 2, we're hoping this will lead to an increase in economic activity.
It already is. It will continue throughout history. That has been the case. It's far more private than is generally perceived. 3/4 of space is private.
Especially for satellites.
Government is still playing a very important role, critical role. It's not going away. It's also bearing some of the cost, but basically government is involved. It's just the real action and the entrepreneurship is coming from the private sector. It's overwhelmingly satellites currently and will remain so. It's a U.S. and Chinese competition.
And there's 2 key players right now.
Yeah, 2 key players. You summarized it well.
You were summarizing. Thank you. Very, very interesting.
And for our listeners, as always, please click on that like button.
Well, please take a look at Bill's paper, The Financial Economics of Spaceflight.
Thank you. And thanks for the SMH. C. I like that. I'll try to figure out a cute little acronym for that.
Thank you, Bill, for visiting with us. We look forward to chatting with you on some interesting topic in the near future.
You bet. Take care, guys.
All right.
Awesome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.